Hello, and this is episode 5. And to mark this podcast milestone, today we're going to be having a discussion that I have to admit I am incredibly excited about. So I've been like a kid waiting for Christmas Day to record this episode. The application of root cause analysis in high performance sport with a lens on football, which is one of my absolute passions. We'll get into how RCA might be used as a framework for understanding causation and how teams can take proactive steps to avoid recurrence and build resilience. So, today we're joined by a very special guest to mark this milestone episode. Dave, to say that you are a highly experienced head of performance and health in the football world and co-host of the Breaking Lines podcast with Gary Rowett really doesn't do it justice. So welcome, and would you be able to tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, George, thanks very much for the introduction, which was making me blush here, but that's not happened many times over my 30-year career in sport. Yes, long-standing veteran of the performance and sports science industry, and worked in the last 28 seasons or so in professional football. Still continue to do work in professional football now as an advisor, as a consultant into clubs, but as of last season, it was 27 seasons down, working at the coalface. Had a lot of great experiences over that time working at clubs like Norwich City, Birmingham City, Colchester United, Stoke, which would be a club close to your heart, I'm sure, Derby County, Millwall as well. So the rich tapestry of English football life. I've done nearly 1,300 professional football games. So seen most things, I think, but not everything.
That's fantastic. And for anyone who missed the in-joke, I'm an Arsenal fan. I don't think we've actually explained that before. But I actually won't probably talk about that too much today. So Dave, thank you for that. We always open episodes with a bit of an icebreaker question, right? So here goes. What for you would be the biggest football-related myth that could be disproven with evidence and data?
Wow. Okay, there you go. That is coming at me from a very different angle. What could be disproven with evidence and data? When you were starting the question, before we got to the evidence and data bit, I think it's the fact that in the stands that people think that the players don't care, and it doesn't matter because they're paid well. But probably if they saw the application, the amount of time, and that could be recorded, the emotions, what we see in terms of the stresses that their bodies go through, what they push themselves to do across their careers would probably tell you that they care a lot more than people would probably want to admit to. Are they young people who are trying to maximize their lives while being young people? Of course they are. And do they always show it in the best way? No, they don't. But I think all of us who don't have to stand in the spotlight would probably be maybe challenged by others if we were in that spotlight. So I think that would probably be the one if you were to look at the actual outputs that they do and people were to go and live a week or a month or even more, a year in the life of a professional sports person, they would see just what the commitments are.
That's fantastic, Dave. And it's a perfect scene set, right, for what some of the stuff that we're going to hopefully talk about. So if we jump in then to the kind of first topic we intend to cover, and that's why problems keep repeating. So if I set the scene for a second from a football perspective, let's say it's mid-February, the transfer window has slammed shut, a team loses half of its defence overnight, right? And I'm not going to lean on the Arsenal reference there. But at a high level, aside from buying players, in your mind, how could teams take steps to prevent that sort of thing from happening again? And what's the current status quo around that?
So I think what you're alluding to here is obviously the fact that people need to keep going and buying players to replace players that maybe they've already got who are now broken. You know, the classic injury crisis that seems to happen from club to club across a season. And yes, of course, over my career, I've seen plenty of those types of situations, and every crisis is not the same, because for some clubs it can be a number of people who are out injured. In another situation, it can be key players that are missing. So you lose 2 or 3 key players, and that's enough of a crisis, even though it's not necessarily a lot of your players, but it's highly influential onto how your team operates. And then, of course, you have certain positions. If you lose 2 or 3 players in the same position, like losing all of your strikers or all of your fullbacks, that equally could be construed as a crisis. And what it really comes down to is, the kind of capabilities within the organization to be able to understand, first of all, what it's doing and how it's doing it. And then if things are perceived to have gone wrong, that they have systems and processes in place that allow themselves to review what has happened and to take the situation and learn from it. It's not necessarily about apportioning blame and pointing fingers, but it is certainly about learning from what has happened on an individual or on a team basis to improve what we do in the future.
And how much of that kind of stepping back and being able to reflect, Dave, happens, I guess, in the moment versus reactively, and let's say at the end of a transfer window or the end of a season?
Yeah, I mean, if I was to take you back to when I started, say, at Norwich City in the last millennium, in 1998, we had very small staff. We had one physio, and I was a sports scientist. I had a number of colleagues with me, but essentially we were 2 people essentially working together for a number of years. So when it came to reviews and kind of getting to the bottom of things, it was certainly experience and opinion which probably led the way. It wasn't data oriented because we weren't really recording things like that back then. Skip forward to today, and we've got very, very big teams, multiple disciplines, working in multidisciplinary teams who are collecting a lot of information. So you can go now down into the weeds with this kind of stuff. And what you're really looking to do is, again, circle the wagons, bring everybody's opinion and all of the information into the room and be able to then reflect on that.
And on that note, kind of reflecting on data, what we often find is that kind of the more complex an organization and their processes become, it is more imperative to step back, to look at the information that's in front of you and not jump to conclusions. As it relates to team sport and specifically football, I imagine that there are multiple almost sources of information, sources of truth. How do you pull together that kind of fragmented ecosystem of information?
Well, when we're doing these reviews, and these happen across the season, going back to your previous question, it's not always an end of season. We sit down and we do this massive debrief. That, of course, will happen. But essentially, yes, what we want to do is we want objective truth as such. We want people's opinions, of course, in the room. But, of course, everyone comes with their own lens. They color that lens with whatever biases and experiences they have. And essentially, they form their own truth about what they think has happened or what occurred. And when we get into the room, yes, of course, we still need those as kind of points of reflection, but we also want a lot of the information to be laid bare on the table, and that you potentially can 360 that information, listen to the other opinions of the room, add yours, and then get to the point where we start stripping back maybe what is conjecture and what is, loose opinion and maybe bias as well, because, we're humans, so we come in with some bias. But data doesn't, and facts have no feelings, do they? They're just going to be laid there bare in front of everyone. So the best organizations, I think, have a way of allowing that information to be continuously shared across the groups, so that continually we're reviewing the information from our own perspectives and then being able to share those into other departments. Now, while it's a great buzzy title at the moment to break down silos, there's also a reason that silos exist, because they allow things to be kept separate, and allow them not to necessarily get, I don't want to use the word polluted too much here, but that you also have to have space where certain disciplines can operate without necessarily being influenced, so they can get on with the work that they would do without any other biases being kind of used to kind of knock them off course. But then in the right environment at the right time, you bring those different silos together and the information that they've filtered down, and then allow that to be, talked about, responded to, and then take the learnings from that to help us.
That's really interesting. And like from, I think you started leaning into that kind of cultural, behavioral element. When you're operating in such a high pressure environment, it's often referred to as like a pressure cooker of a football club. Is there that danger that there can be a blame culture? And I guess in your mind, would that potentially prevent the right analysis from being done?
Of course it can. If people have done things wrong, the first thing they want to do is, potentially not get blamed for it.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to think that they're doing a good job, and when they make mistakes, especially if it is a high pressure environment like football can be, where the mistakes can be career threatening, not only to the health of a player, for example, but also to the employment of those who are in charge of the team. For example, you lose a major player because somebody wasn't on top of the kind of load parameters, weren't flagging issues, something goes wrong, and then of course that affects the team. It affects results. Results, if they get affected enough, means people lose their jobs. So of course you don't want to be the person, putting your hand up necessarily saying, yeah, I missed something, therefore it's my fault. However, it's not normally the case that it's one person to blame when something goes wrong in a football club, So while we obviously see the person on the sideline who normally is copping a lot of flack from the fans when results aren't going well, I think everybody will recognize if the defenders don't defend well and they're not assisted by other players, then you're going to concede goals. If your attackers aren't scoring, possibly because of, they don't take the chances, they don't concentrate enough, they haven't trained well enough, but also there's no supply and the midfielders aren't, distributing the ball well enough, or the tactics are set up, then that's not necessarily their fault either. So I think when it comes down to, doing an almost an RCA of either an injury crisis or a season's results, you normally find that there's plenty of places where we could place our chips as such in terms of who should be accountable. And I think when it comes down to whether it's calling it blame or responsibility, again, where we have a mature system that's constantly reviewing itself, there should be enough people looking at all of the information with enough opinions. That's why managers have teams of coaches. That's why in other departments we have a range of different professionals, whether it's nutrition or strength conditioning or physiotherapy or doctors looking after the health of the players. There's enough people to be casting their eye over the information, to be leaning in to say, we don't think things are right, or we think things are going really well as well.
So the differing opinions and the professional challenge, I always think back to Alex Ferguson, right? Even though I'm an Arsenal fan, I think back to he always surrounded himself with different diverse perspectives, changed his assistants every year to get that view, right?
Absolutely.
So if we think then about, you mentioned RCA mindset and approaches. A lot of what we talk about when we meet with clients and we discuss root cause analysis is moving beyond the what to the why. In your mind, do the systems exist within professional sport and football at the moment, to be able to move from the understanding kind of what happened to really drive into the why it may have happened?
I think it's becoming more evident, that people are starting to look beyond the what and looking at the why. And there's certainly some great systems in place where we now understand the complexity of, say, for example, underperformance or
Mm,
injury. For example, we know it's not necessarily one specific thing that causes an injury. It will normally be a multifactorial set of circumstances that's going to have created the environment for the injury to happen. Now, of
mm,
course, when we look at injuries, which is always the one that we end up going really, really deep on, is you have your classic externally non-preventable, non-modifiable injuries. If somebody decides that they're going to tackle you badly, then there's not an awful lot that you can do about that. You can do all of the strength and conditioning in the
yeah.
world. If somebody decides that your ankle is going to be subject to the full force of a tackle,
Yep.
that's not something we can do anything about. And more often than not, of course, we just place those injuries into a separate bucket. But then we have the ones which are what people would like to say preventable, or we could have modified something within the system to allow the player to mitigate the risk of injury. And those come down to everything from the amount of training we do, the types of training we do, whether they're exposed to the right elements of training at the right time and in the right order, in order to allow the players not only to adapt, because training is not only there for the tactical preparation; it's there to physically prepare the players. And we're always on the edge of a knife, because we do too much, the player breaks. We don't do enough, the player's underexposed, not ready enough. So it's not a pure science where you know X plus Y equals Z. There's so many other things that are going to affect that. We also know that players who've had previous injuries are at greater risk of getting future injuries. We know that age is an issue as well. We know that other lifestyle factors suddenly come into it. So where we see players who are in quite stressful situations, maybe home life, maybe friendship groups, maybe they've got other things going on in their life, these aren't always apparent when the player gets injured, that was the reason they got injured. And that's where a good system can then reflect on itself. And more often than not, now we're trying to collect more diverse and interesting sources of information, soft data from conversations, from different time points with different people, which previously would have been quite sacrosanct, So when they're speaking to the soft tissue therapist or even the chef or the player liaison officer, and some piece of information is within the system which would have unlocked the reason why something happened. Not necessarily what happened, but why it happened. And it turns out that if we had have known about it, we could have done something. And the more mature systems that we're now seeing in other countries and other sports are pointing us in the way that actually, if we collect this information, we can make better decisions and make them early.
That's so interesting, Dave. And it really, whilst you were talking specifically about football, actually a lot of what you're saying could almost apply to the other clients and other industries that we speak with. That it's about having the data, having that RCA mindset of not looking for blame, of looking for things that can be objectively proven, look for solutions that are actually going to address the cause or causes. Um, and I guess a question I would have on the back of that is, we often talk a lot about incidents. Clearly, it might be in a football context, injuries, but also we also try to open kind of people's minds to using RCA where they might have had near misses, but also where things have gone well. I assume that would also apply in a football context as well.
Absolutely, yeah. when in the course of my work, I'm trying to pass information through to, key stakeholders, be they head coach, manager, sporting director, heads of departments, we're also flagging issues that we see as being potential risks.
Right.
So of course we see the injuries when they happen, um, but you don't know about all of the injuries that you didn't have. So as you call them there, the near misses, the player who was potentially on edge, who got away with it. And often
Mm.
there's a sweep of the brow. We got away with that one, but essentially just getting away from it is not enough of an excuse to just go there again and hope and, have fingers crossed or whatever you believe in that's going to give you good luck, that the player will survive the next time. Each game is different. We don't know what it's going to throw at us. Of course, we can do a pre-analysis. And we've done that in the past where we know if a certain player is going to play up against one of our players, that's going to be a major risk for them, not just in terms of the performance, but in terms of the physical health that they might come out with at the end of it. If I'm going to have to sprint up against someone like Adame Traore every week, who's a exceptionally fast player, I'm probably going to know if I'm up against that and I haven't done the work to ensure that I'm healthy and I'm recovered and I'm refreshed, that I could put myself at risk of injury. So those kind of near misses are something we definitely are starting to learn from more, which is, just getting away with it is not enough to say that the system has done its work. It's again a unique set of factors that might have happened that allowed that, to happen, but it doesn't mean that should be then taken as our methodology and our philosophy of how we do things for the future.
So it's that almost, again, going back to that high complexity point, and obviously in football, in professional sport, as well as having you're playing again 3 days later in most cases. So someone getting away with an injury, and we've all seen it, right? That you have a player who goes down, they look injured, they carry on, and then they come out again 3 days later. And in your mind as a fan, you're even thinking, I'm a little bit concerned here about their long-term availability. But with that high complexity, obviously what we have seen in other industries, so things like aviation, things like healthcare, financial services, who are at varying stages of adoption of root cause analysis, but use it to build kind of reliability and resilience in what they do. It does feel like lessons could be taken from those industries where they also operate in high degrees of complexity to help with kind of understanding and analysis and decision making in sport as well.
Without a doubt, all of those industries are far further down the road in terms of using RCA in order to improve what they do. And football and sport is, immature, to use that term, in terms of applying something like RCA. As you said there, with something like financial services or let's say medicine, is very, very good at reflecting on, what went wrong, and learning from that. The airplane industry, using black box technology or, other forms, has continually improved what it's doing, because all of those industries, certainly medicine and aviation, you're dealing with, again, safety of people. Now, does that mean that sport shouldn't be concerned about results? Because ultimately that's what probably sport and the financial industry are both looking at, especially in the professional era where money counts, So if it comes to a big game and you need your big player out there, are you willing to suddenly change your risk profile because the amount of money that could be made from winning this game far overrides, necessarily the player's health? And that comes down to, the kind of ethics and philosophy of each individual club, but it can also come down to the beliefs of the player, that they believe that they want to play in a game like that and they are willing to take the risk with breaking down because they want to be part of that game. And I suppose that's one of the elements which probably makes sports slightly different to
Mhm.
the others, is that the human element of calculating risk and being able to say, well, I'll play with that, or the fact that even the players will cover up something, in order to make themselves available for a big game,
Mm.
means that we don't always have all of the facts available to us. And then, like any kind of investigation afterwards, you suddenly find out, the player knew he was at risk. He knew he had a problem. He just didn't tell anybody. And as we say to the players, it's a two-way street in terms of the sharing of information. Is that we can't guess. Um, we can't guess about things that we don't know about, so the responsibility is on them to share as much information as honestly as they can with us, because then we can make good decisions, not only for their health but also for their performance as well.
And it's so interesting. You spoke about kind of looking backwards. So, a game's finished and you're looking back at kind of what's happened during the match. From a tactical breakdown perspective, so let's say, for instance, during a phase of play, you know, the level of intensity really dropped, or patterns of play that had been agreed, or tactics that had been agreed had failed. In your mind, Dave, where could something like root cause analysis help with kind of understanding that and then baking that into your going forward approach?
Yeah, I think if you were to look at the balance of time spent in preparation versus time spent in review of tactics and game plans and um, the opposition analysis, it's obviously heavily skewed into the preparation phase.
Right.
Um, because, as you said earlier, in 3 days' time we can be on to the next game. So we're constantly swinging from preparation, perform, play the game,
Mm.
quick review, learn lessons, move ahead. Um, the great thing about tactics is there's two teams, aren't there, in most sports competing against each other. So even the best laid plans don't account for the fact that the opposition may change what they do. You may change what you do to them. The players will probably have changed. Somebody's likely to have swapped out of a team. Um, they might be looking to exploit you in certain ways, while they also know that you're going to exploit them. So no two games are the same, in which case, when it comes to the RCA, we're also taking the fact of how did they change? How did we change from what we normally do? How well was the game plan implemented that we came up with? How well constructed were our tactics going into the game? Because we formulate the game plan, and then we'll see if we actually implemented it. But if we got the game plan wrong, even if we implemented it 100% correctly, what we had planned to do, if it was wrong, it's still wrong. So I think a lot of it comes down to, trying to match up how right we got our plan versus what then changed that affected us. And that's why you see managers having to tweak formations quickly in games, having to shift tactics in games, because suddenly what they thought was going to happen is not actually what's happening. So very, very quickly and astutely, good managers can recognize when what they had thought was going to happen isn't happening, and then they change and they pivot. And that's probably what makes the most successful managers so successful. I remember one game that we had with Norwich City, where we were playing Chelsea with Jose Mourinho. He made a substitution, which then we reacted to by making two subs, because we thought, okay, he's changed tactic here. Therefore, we need to now counter that by doing something else. So we did that, and it was like a bluff. The first substitute that he did was to get a reaction from us, to show our hand as to what we were planning to do next. And then he pivoted again. And suddenly, it's the old classic, you've got your armies in the wrong position, the attack was somewhere else. And now, essentially, because we only had three subs back then, that we're
Of
locked
course,
in.
yeah.
We can't do anything. So you also have to be aware of things like that as well. So when it comes down to it, sometimes you have to hold your hands up and say they had better players, or they strategized better, or the manager was just better at tactically working the game.
So just, I guess, a thought around preparation for the next game. So I think certainly in my mind, others may not have the same view, but when I think of scouting, you think of some guy set up in the terraces watching kind of a game play out, reporting back. Do you think elements of root cause analysis could help in the scouting of games that are going on in preparation for a team's next game?
Yeah, and I think that is starting to happen. Some of the
Right.
really good analysis systems are very, very good at being able to understand why a player may have performed how they did in a certain game.
Mm.
That they're able to look at, for example, how certain players play against certain types of opposition, certain tactic types, what they do, for example, when their team is losing, do they change behaviors? So that we can now kind of almost take that uh, those, those kind of levels that you would see maybe on a mixing desk, and know that, okay, if he's in a nice comfortable situation where his team are winning 2-0 against this type of opposition, they perform in that way. But if you put them into a certain other situation, they don't perform well, either technically, tactically, psychologically, physically. So those are good pieces of information to then feed back up the system when you're talking about, for example, how you might tactically prepare going into a game. And you will hear in the media from time to time head coaches talking about, this is not this player's type of game, because the root cause analysis that's been done over time has shown that against this type of opposition, against how they play, he is not someone who's going to excel in those games. So we're starting to see more of that coming into the game. And certainly clubs like Brentford or Brighton have been very, very good at identifying, probably a bit like in Moneyball, but those players who will get on base more often. They'll perform more consistently over a longer time against more different types of opposition than maybe your more high profile player who isn't going to be motivated when he's playing what he would see as a smaller team. They're a big game player, in which case, yeah, they might be a great token player, but across a whole season, they're maybe not going to show their full worth.
That's so interesting, Dave. And I guess if I think about refereeing and VAR as an example, not to use a swear word, but what about in that context? Like, to me as a passionate football fan, I watch football every weekend. It's talk that ends up down the pub. They've made the wrong decision, the right decision. It's gone to VAR. It was wrong. It's right. Whatever. But it's provocative. It can be wrong. Sometimes quite clearly. I guess, what in your mind could be done from an RCA perspective around refereeing and VAR decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I've sat in enough touchlines and heard enough fans and coaches have wrong opinions about laws of the game.
Yeah.
So I think in the first instance, let let he who is without sin cast the first stone. So if you don't actually understand the laws of the game, and how they should be applied, classic. A player plays the ball onto his own hand is not a handball.
Yeah.
So that is fundamentally, that is written in the rules. If you were to kick the ball onto your own hand, it's not a handball, accidentally, of course. So if you throw your hand out and put it in the way,
Yep.
different, because that's a deliberate intention. So there's one thing, which is, where are the opinions coming from as to whether VAR is correct or not? And the majority of time, unfortunately, pundits and most fans don't, and a lot of coaches don't understand fully the laws of the game. On the other side, how could VAR benefit from RCA? Well, first of all, it's not objective, is it? It's still coming down to um, the human side of the game. We're still asking referees and assistant referees to make an opinion on what they see on video. And as we know, when they watch VAR, they're watching it in super slow-mo from maybe 12 different angles. So of course they're able to, in those moments, slow something down and see it very, very precisely. But that's also not how sport is played. It's played at full speed. It's played with emotion. It's played with humans who do strange things. Like not everybody behaves and does things in the same way all the time. So I think they have to be given some scope to make an opinion based on like what would they have done and what have I seen a lot of other players do in those situations, and that's going to give me an opinion. When it comes down to the communication of it, of course, like no fan can sit there and say they don't have a bias towards whether they want the opinion to go their way or the other way. If it's a VAR against you, of course, your bias, it's 80% going to be, it's going to get it wrong because they favor the opposition, is the classic one.
Yeah.
And how many interviews will you hear this year where and over the years, where you hear somebody say they balance themselves out over the year? And of course, nobody ever keeps a track of that, but it always seems like the big teams get all decisions and the other teams don't. But quite often, of course, the big teams are in your penalty area far more than you're in theirs. So, kind of the stats would probably back up that they do get more decisions because they're in those positions more. They get more penalties and they get more free kicks because they have higher possession of the ball, for example. So RCA, I think they are learning from that. Is it going to be perfect? I think everybody's got an opinion whether they think offside should be clear daylight or it should be just a toenail's width. So I suppose it depends on your bias. If you're somebody who grew up watching sport in the 80s, where there was no technology and it was a lot of fun, the arguments were down the pub afterwards that the referee got everything wrong.
Yeah.
And VAR was brought in to stop that. But you were still down the pub saying that the referee or VAR got everything wrong. So we've just moved it into a television booth somewhere in London and asked those guys to make what essentially has become now business decisions. Are they truly in the interest of sport, or is it to stop somebody getting sued at the end of the season because one decision cost the club £150 million?
Yeah, which goes back to that high pressure, high kind of, critical view of things, right? And if we think about kind of RCA as a tool, again, to move from that, getting things wrong, finger pointing, to almost that continual learning mindset. Within football, Dave, how much kind of space is there for people to, have that psychological safety to be able to embed things like RCA into their daily routines, to surface problems early, to not point fingers, and to make sure that we learn as we move forward?
I think it's becoming, we're creating that environment for people to be able to do that. If you look at the spectrum of managers nowadays, they're far more analytical than maybe they were previously. They seem to be a lot more emotionally controlled than they were previously. How they manage players and environments has, again, to use that word, matured an awful lot, where you don't have necessarily one iconic figure running a club anymore who's telling everybody what to do and has got an opinion about everybody's job. And if he doesn't agree with it, can just ignore it. So that has changed, which allows people the space to say, I disagree, or I have a different opinion, and that they can surface that. Now, of course, if you're looking at a working environment where everybody is able to contribute and is valued, and you leave your ego and you leave your position at the door when you walk in. Bolton Wanderers always used to talk about their war room, where essentially you would leave all that outside, you could come in and speak freely. I think that's a utopian kind of viewpoint, because quite often people will still walk out of the room and they've had their psychology changed because somebody said something about the work that they did and how they did it. So I don't think everybody can say that that's not necessarily, uh, a pure place where it's in a vacuum of emotion. But what we want to get down to now is where accountability lies within the system, necessarily within the person, because if the person wasn't there or the person left and was replaced by somebody with a different skill set, would the system still persist and been able to allow us to get to the kind of decision making position that we want to be in? So the system persists rather than being reliant on the people. Of course, you need people with good experience and good knowledge to be able to build that system. And probably that's a challenge in a lot of clubs where they employ a lot of young, less experienced people into senior roles and titles where they probably haven't done the groundwork in something like that. And certainly in my experience, I've not seen RCA as a methodology persist in a club yet. But I think it's something that's going to start to come because, let's be honest, the amount of money at stake now keeps growing year on year on year. So I think investment into something like that is going to be important.
I've just got this mental image of going into a room at Bolton with Sam Allardyce and trying to disagree with him. Dave is probably someone that I wouldn't want to pick a fight with.
But then that's also the case that how people are perceived in public, how they speak in an interview or seen on the sideline can be very, very different to how they speak when they're in the confines of their dressing room. I've had managers bawling at me on the sideline, and then 5 minutes later they're apologizing for what they've done and how they've said things because they realize that in the pressure of the moment, actually what you were trying to help them with, they let some other emotions affect what they were then, how they responded. And actually what they need to do was just like take a step back and listen to what was said. It's there to try and help them, not to try and hinder what they do.
And it's that further layer of complexity, right? The human psyche, the human emotion, not to try and be all, psychological on this, but actually that becomes a real complex factor that when we understand that better, how a certain person or player or member of staff might react in a certain situation, it enables us to prepare better, to kind of communicate better as a collective and move to that continuous learning environment where we, to your point, I think it was around accountability within the system rather than accountability that purely sits within people who are emotion led. Clearly, we all are. And then what we want is for the kind of crises mentality to become the exception rather than the norm where possible.
Absolutely. And I think when it comes down to it, unfortunately, we do sometimes get to a position where people have to be held accountable. Yep. Because if the system has been flagging things and they've not been acting on it, then that is a failure of people. Yeah. That is maybe a failure in sometimes their capability or their capacity. They don't recognize the signs or they don't have enough bandwidth to be able to allow them to do the analysis that they should do, because the club's potentially under-resourcing in certain aspects, and spending money and other things that are, maybe not as worthy of that money, so for example, do you invest in another strength and conditioning member of staff who will add value to your squad for a whole year for 35,000, or do you go on a mid-season trip to Dubai or Marbella, for a jolly up, and you spend £50,000 on that 4-day kind of team bonding? I think one part of the club would say, well, we need the team bonding bit because that's important to create a team. But the other side would say, well, I can get 365 days of 25 players being improved by a strength and conditioning coach. So when we have the injury crisis, it probably won't be blamed on the team bonding. It'll probably be blamed on not having enough people in those roles. So I think there's always judgment calls for, how we could improve the system. But fundamentally, if you've got people who are haven't developed a system, that's a concern. You've got then the challenge that if you do have a system and it's telling you the information, but you're not acting on it or don't see it, again, somebody's probably going to have to be either educated better and supported better in allowing them to see that, or they don't have the capability to do that and they didn't flag things, in which case, they probably are people that you need to surround either with better people or find others.
Yeah, and it's just adding that layer of data and evidence through techniques like RCA to make better decisions, right? So look, we've covered an awful lot, and for me, it's been an absolute pleasure talking about work and football in one conversation. I guess, Dave, if you wanted to leave viewers and listeners with kind of one key takeaway from your perspective, what would it be?
What would I take away? I mean, sport is so unique. It's so black and white normally in terms of, success and failure. And everybody, I suppose, has an opinion as to what they view that as being. So for some people, winning the league is the only thing that matters. And if you don't, everything else is failure. For some people, just staying in the league can be success. So when it comes to using something like RCA or looking at that through the lens of sport, I think it's creating the environment for people to be able to express their opinions, backed up with evidence in a non-judgmental, kind of psychologically safe environment, where over time the system becomes so robust because people feel so involved within it that we end up getting to the point where everybody trusts the systems that are in place. We're not there yet, but creating good systems and processes allows us to continually learn and make better decisions for the long term.
That's fantastic. So, Dave, where can people find you if they want to know more about you, about the work you do?
I suppose, like the rest of humanity now, it's on social media, either LinkedIn. It's all just at my name. I was one of those kind of early people who got in and got my name. So at Dave Carolan, whether it's on LinkedIn, it's on Twitter or X, Instagram, anything like that. Or email is dave@davecarolan.com.
Fantastic. Look, Dave, I want to say a thank you from both myself, but also What Caused This for joining us. And a thank you to everyone for watching and for listening. We hope you found this episode, insightful and interesting and on a topic that is clearly very close to a lot of people's hearts. So Dave, thanks again. And until next time, we'll say goodbye.
Thanks, George. Thank you.